Boa tarde. Bem-vindas e bem-vindos novamente ao seminário Os Fins da Democracia, seminário que é realizado pelo Consórcio Internacional de...
Welcome to today's event. It's great to have you here. It's a partnership between the University of São Paulo, Social Service of São Paulo. I'd like to recall that this event is being streamed. Access www.sp.org.br and check it out. Remain in the room. You can use your image here. If you ask questions, please look for the production at the end to authorize the use of your image. Let's invite now Judith Butler. She will be the mediator of this first session in the afternoon.
Actually, I'm canceling the last session, and I'm just going to give a public lecture on gender, I thought. Seriously, I will have some remarks later today. First of all, let me just once again express my enormous gratitude to Sesc for housing us, for giving us this beautiful room space, for the care and the courage with which they have housed us and given us a place to do our collaborative thinking. Of course, collaborative thinking is not always simple. There are moments of conflict. There are moments where we see that we're working in incommensurable paradigms. But to let all that unfold and then to see what is the work we need now to do is crucial for this project and for ongoing cross-regional and international collaborations of the kind that are so important to the International Consortium for Critical Theory Programs. I'm very pleased this afternoon to moderate this panel. You have met all the characters before, for those of you who have been here, but I'd like at least to give them a brief introduction. Natalia Brizuela has been moderating beautifully, and she opened the conference with her important essay and presentation on Ni Una Menos. And she is my colleague at the University of California at Berkeley, where she is a professor of modern and contemporary Latin American literature and culture. And she's distinguished in many ways, but she works between Spanish and Portuguese and tries to think about Latin American culture and politics through a double lens, always moving between the two languages. So she represents a certain kind of trilingual thinking and an important perspective for us. She's been crucial as one of the organizers of this conference and also as somebody whose intellectual work on photography and imperialism and on the critical potential of photographic images has been important for cultural studies and art studies in our university and beyond. She's working on a study of time as critique in contemporary aesthetics, and that's all I know about it, but I know that I'm going to ask her to present on that at some point because the topic is too good. Paula Biglieri is somebody I've known for a while. She is a researcher at CONICET, and she is largely understood to be the person who has old and lives of Ernesto Laclau and continues to think within the framework of the theory of heading it for our time, investigating the relationship between the theory of hegemony and psychoanalysis, which is one of her most important books, but also thinking carefully about what it means to speak as the people, what kind of utterance that is, and how we might think about these populist invocations by way. Paula will be one of our presenters today. Actually, I introduced Natalia. I thanked Natalia, but in fact, Natalia is not speaking during this session. Sorry, Natalia. But my unconscious wanted me to have a chance to thank you publicly. So that was a triumph for the unconscious and perhaps also for the conference, and we'll leave that be. The speakers this afternoon are Paula and
Lacan, the record holder, the philanthropist, the star, and the bonded laborer. It may cause some strangeness, the heterogeneity of these four social types. But the first three are marked by the sign of exceptionality. That is, the record holder, whether he is an outstanding entrepreneur or sportsman, then the philanthropist, who represents the moral exceptionality, and the star, which indicates aesthetic exceptionality. This group of 3 points out of the curve differs from the other group, which is those which are having servitude at work, figures without qualities, individual defined by his function, the person without distinction. So on the one side, the common attitude, and on the other, the prototypes, contemporary prototypes of heroism. Crime becomes in here the rule of composition of this heterogeneity. Thanks to publicity, that is, thanks to center conformation of public space, the experience of exceptionality of the criminal, of the one who violates the law, becomes integrated into the law. Now, the three figures are also representatives of what may be called excessive enjoyment, the enjoyment of the other, the enjoyment of the more, in the grammar of democratic recognition that some have and others do not.
Alguns têm, outros não, a internalização de certas estruturas democráticas.
They internalize
Lacan fala
democratic structures. Lacan talks
Essas
about them.
Nas
Quote,
quais uma assimilação social do indivíduo, levado ao extremo, mostra sua correlação com uma tensão agressiva, cuja relativa impunidade no Estado é muito perceptível para o sujeito de uma cultura diferente. Aparecem invertidas quando, segundo o processo formal já descrito por Platão, a tirania sucede à democracia e efetua com os indivíduos reduzidos ao seu número ordinal o ato cardinal da adição, prontamente seguido pelas outras três operações da aritmética. Ou seja, a realização social do ideal democrático, como ordem social de igualdade, aumenta necessariamente a tensão agressiva entre os indivíduos, o que os impulsiona para a luta de prestígio e de distinção, para tomar parte na elite, que parece constituir uma primeira negação da democracia, uma negação que nos faz lembrar, por exemplo, Tocqueville. O Estado aparece como excessivamente tolerante até o processo, pois ele interpreta a concorrência e a desigualdade como prova mundial democrática da diversidade e do antagonismo ou da livre concorrência. Essa inanidade do Estado diante do antagonismo social é a segunda forma de negação da democracia, como se fosse, então, todos já livres em livre concorrência. O estrangeiro notará mais facilmente, ainda comentando a passagem acima, a iniquidade que nos aparece assim como uma terceira forma de negação, interna e externa à democracia. Ou seja, uma espécie de aplicação seletiva da lei. Nesse caso, as estruturas democráticas aparecem invertidas no processo de sucessão formal entre democracia e tirania.
and tyranny.
No processo descrito por Platão,
In the process
a
described by
distinção
Plato,
produzida
the
pela democracia
distinction between democracy
com a criação de suas
with the
oligarquias
creation of
torna a
its
tirania uma
oligarchies
tentação
made
constante.
tyranny a constant
Afinal,
threat
por
or
que não um
a
governo dos
temptation.
melhores?
Why not with a government of the
A
best
quarta e
ones?
última figura da
And then
negação da democracia
The
em Lacan
fourth figure of the
parece
denial of
descrever o que
democracy
se
in
passa
Lacan
no que
seems to
Jacques
describe
Rancière
what
chamou de
happens,
ódio à democracia.
what Rancière
Ou
called
seja, a gente viu uma
hate to democracy.
manifestação recente
We saw in a
disso, né?
recent demonstration
Ou seja,
of
o
that.
sentimento
feeling
derivado,
that
a
is
interpretação
derived
de que a
of the
democracia é injusta,
interpretation that democracy
que ela
is unfair,
legitima as
that it
diferenças que
legitimizes
deveria
the
e que prometeu
differences
eliminar.
that it had promised to
Aqui surgem então as duas operações que são o
to
foco do meu
erase.
texto.
So here the two operations that are the
Primeiro, os
focus of my
indivíduos são
text.
reduzidos à sua
First of
forma
all, the individuals
ordinal
are
e depois
reduced to its
constrangidos ao
original
ato
form and then
cardinal da
constrained in the
adição, da
cardinal
soma.
act of addition.
Ou seja, os
The
indivíduos
sum.
são
So therefore,
hierarquizados,
the
primeiros,
people are first of all
segundos, terceiros. Por
hierarchized,
exemplo,
first,
em
second,
cidadãos de
third.
primeira ou
In,
segunda
for example,
classe.
citizens of first and
Pessoas
second
visíveis
class,
ou pessoas
invisible or
invisíveis.
visible
Gêneros
people.
discerníveis ou gêneros
Gender that we can
indiscerníveis.
discern and
Depois
others
desse
that we cannot.
ordenamento, e só
After
depois
this
disso,
ordering, and
eles
only
são então
after
objetos
that,
de um ato
they are then
cardinal.
objects of a cardinal
Ora, o ato
act.
cardinal é aquele que
And
cifra os
the
indivíduos de
cardinal
tal
act
maneira
is that
que eles
the
se
one
tornam
that
objetos,
separate individuals
objetos
in
de
a way that
repasses,
they
de
become
distribuições, de
objects
cálculos
of
atuariais ou políticas
calculations and
públicas,
public
que somam,
policies
subtraem,
and so
multiplicam ou
on, that
dividem
add
recursos.
and divide
eliminam
and
recursos.
multiply or
Eles se tornam
finish
essa
with
matéria-prima
resources. They
impensante,
become this
impensada,
raw
chamada
material
povo,
that's called people.
cuja voz todos tentam se
which
apossar
voice each one
como
tries
fonte e
to
origem do
make
poder.
use of as source of
Mas
power,
poucos tentam
but few
escutar
of them try
como
to
fim
listen
e
to their voice as
objetivo do poder.
end and goal of
E
power.
é assim que se forma,
And
segundo
that
Lacan,
is how,
esta
according to
espécie de
Lacan, this
injustiça na
sort of
polis.
unfairness
Eu cito
is
última vez
established in the
essa
polis.
passagem do texto de
And I'm
Lacan.
going to quote Lacan
Abre-se,
now.
então, o campo
It
de
opens,
concentração
therefore, the field of
para cuja
concentration,
alimentação as qualificações
and the
intencionais da
qualifications
rebelião
of the
são menos
rebellion
decisivas
are less
do que uma
decisive
certa relação
than a
quantitativa
relation,
entre massa social e massa
than a
excluída.
certain quantitative
Seja o
relation
campo de
between social
concentração
mass and
diz
excluded
respeito a uma
mass.
certa operação
The concentration
comparativa,
camp, for
cardinal,
example, is
entre a
respect of a
massa social,
comparative operation
chamada
between
povo, e
social
massa
mass, the
excluída,
so-called
os
people,
invisíveis,
and the
os
excluded
indiscerníveis,
ones, the ones we
aqueles que
cannot
são de
see,
segunda ou
the
terceira
ones that are
classe.
from the second or third class.
Esta mesma ideia será
This
repetida
first
sinteticamente
idea will be
17 anos
repeated
mais tarde
synthetically
na conhecida
17
afirmação
years later in the
Lacan
well-known statement
de que
by
nosso
Lacan
futuro de
that,
mercados
quote, our future of
comuns,
common
ele está
markets,
falando do mercado comum
he's talking
europeu,
about the European
que
common
precedeu a
market
União
that
Europeia,
preceded the European
encontrará
Union,
então,
will
nosso futuro de
find
mercados
its
comuns
balance
encontrará seu equilíbrio
in
numa
a
ampliação cada
more
vez mais
and
dura
more
dos processos
tough
de
expansion
segregação.
of the processes of
A grande
segregation.
questão, portanto, é saber
So therefore,
como essas duas coisas
how
se
these two
relacionam.
things
Por
relate
que
to each other and
o
why
aumento do mercado
the
comum
expansion
gera
of the common
necessariamente
market
segregação.
generates
Portanto, a
necessarily
exclusão
segregation.
interna
So
causada pelo
therefore,
ato
this is
cardinal,
the external
cuja
exclusion
condição é o
caused by the
pré-ordenamento
Cardinal
dos
Act,
indivíduos
which
e a
condition
divisão
is the
entre massa
preordination
social e
of
massa
individuals and the
excluída,
division between
está na raiz
social
dos
mass and
processos de
excluded
reversão e
mass,
de
that it is
inversão
at the
da
root of the process
democracia
of
em
reversion
tirania.
and inversion of democracy into
Recapitulo.
tyranny. Let's recap.
Primeiro, há uma
First,
tensão
there is an
agressiva
aggressive
produzida pela
tension produced
assimilação
by
de
the
indivíduos,
assimilation of individuals,
que é
which is
generalizada como
generalized as
expansão
an
do processo
expansion of the
democrático,
democratic
ou
process.
seja, a inclusão
That is
de
the
mais
inclusion of more
pessoas,
people,
a inclusão dos
the
diferentes,
inclusion of the
a
different
ampliação
ones,
da
the broadening
participação.
of the participation,
gera tensão
which
agressiva.
generate aggressive
Aqui
tension.
o signo de angústia não
Here, the
aparece
sign
apenas
of
como
anguish
discurso
did
sobre
not
a
appear
diferença,
only as a
mas
discourse
também como
about
presença
difference, but
encarnada
also as an
e
incarnate
experiência real
about
do
the
estrangeiro.
real experience
acompanhou no
of the
Brasil.
foreign.
De repente,
As we
começamos a
saw in
reencontrar
Brazil, all of a
aquele
sudden
que era um
we start
estrangeiro
to
invisível.
find again
Segundo ponto,
the invisible
surgem
foreigner.
então os quatro
Second,
tipos
there
de
are 4 types of
excepcionalidade
exceptionality
e
and
distinção,
distinction,
organizados ao modo
organized
de
in a
uma
matter
luta
of
por
a
prestígio
struggle
e
for
reconhecimento.
prestige and
A
recognition.
estrela,
The
o
star,
recordista,
the
o homem
sportsman,
especial,
the record,
acima
the
da
special
lei.
man, above the law.
Terceiro,
Third,
o momento da redução dos
the
indivíduos
moment
a
of the
números
reduction of
ordinais,
individuals to ordinal
seguida
numbers,
pelo ato
followed by the
cardinal, pelo qual
cardinal act by
ingressamos na
which we enter
contabilidade obscena,
into the obscene
pela qual
accounting by
adicionamos,
which we add,
subtraímos,
subtract,
multiplicamos ou
multiply or
dividimos os
divide
indivíduos
individuals
pelos
by
bens,
their,
pelos
according
patrimônios, pelos recursos, pelos ministérios.
4,
Formam-se os espaços de segregação instituída e
are
normalizada,
established and
os
formed
campos de
the
concentração,
concentration camps,
os condomínios, os espaços
the
reservados
reserved
sobre os quais se
spaces on which
justifica a
tyranny is
tirania como
justified
governo dos
as the
poucos
government
para
of
os
the few
poucos.
for the few.
Temos, então,
Then we
4
have 4
figuras de
figures of
negação da
denial of
democracia.
democracy.
A primeira é a
The first
confusão
one is the
entre
confusion
distinção e
between
diferença.
distinction and difference.
Como lidar com a
How
diversidade
to deal with
antropológica.
the
E ela tem uma
anthropological
expressão em termos de
diversity
sofrimento
and
que é
the
a anomia.
expression of the
Segundo,
suffering, which is the anomia.
como lidar com a
Second, the
emergência da
emergence of
excepcionalidade
excessive
excessiva.
exceptionality.
Aquela diferença que não se integra ao jogo para o tratamento da
to the
diferença pela
game,
palavra.
the
E a gente tem um
difference
segundo
as such.
sofrimento
And then we
social,
have a
que é o
second
antagonismo.
social suffering, which is antagonism.
Terceiro,
And
a
then
inversão da democracia em
the,
tirania.
the inversion
Ou
of
seja,
democracy
essa
into
inversão
tyranny,
que
that is this
nasce do
inversion that is
sentimento de
born out
injustiça,
of
mas
the
acaba
feeling of
perpetuando
injustice,
esse
but
mesmo
end
sentimento
up by
de justiça.
perpetuating this
É a
very
justiça
feeling
feita
of
pelas próprias mãos.
unfairness and
É a
justice.
justiça de
Justice
poucos
made by
para
their
poucos.
own hands, justice
E o
of a
quarto
few
momento,
to a few.
um
And
momento
then
de
fourth,
consagração
the
e
moment
generalização
of
da tirania.
general
É o momento em
consecration
que a
of
gente assume e
tyranny, which is
interioriza a
when
lógica
we
da segregação.
interiorize the
E aí
logic of
estamos nos
segregation,
campos
and
de
here we
concentração.
are in the concentration camps.
Retenhamos que o ato
So
cardinal
we
refere-se
understand
à
that the
tomada de um
cardinal
número
act
no interior de uma
refers
série
to
ordenada,
the
por exemplo,
number
o
in
de
a
30º dia
ordinal
do mês,
series,
pelo
for
seu valor
example,
de face,
the third
ou seja,
day of
30.
the month for its
Quando
face
falamos
value,
em
let's say
séries
30.
fechadas,
When we
operações
talk about
simples.
closed
No entanto,
series,
quando pensamos
simple
em dois tipos de
operations, but when we
infinito,
think
é isso
about
que está
two
em causa
sorts of
aqui,
infinites,
a operação corresponde à
the
redução de uma
operation
ordem aberta, como
corresponds
se
to
espera da
an
democracia,
open
como uma
source,
ideia
as
por
it's
vir,
expected
como
by
uma ideia
democracy,
não
as
concluída,
a not
a
concluded
uma ordem
idea
fechada.
to a
Ou
closed
seja, a sua
order,
presentificação
which is
atual
its current
no horizonte de uma enumeração
presentification
possível e
in a
comparável.
horizon of a possible
Essa diferença crucial
enumeration.
entre a
This
universalização
crucial
e a
difference between
totalização.
universalization and totalization.
As duas outras
The
menções
two
de
other
Lacan à
mentions of
democracia
Lacan to
retomam a série
democracy
formada
return to the series
por essa
formed by
sequência.
this sequence.
Assimilação,
Assimilation,
excepcionalidade,
exceptionality,
inversão
inversion,
e ou universalização
and
ou tirania.
universalization or
Por exemplo,
tyranny.
na carta a
For
Lowenstein, em
example, in his
53,
letter to
ele
Lowenstein
se
in
mostra interessado pelos processos
1953,
de Praga,
he's interested in
porque
the
vem
Prague
aparecer
process
na
because
lógica do laço
he
social
sees to
entre os
appear in the
psicanalistas
logic
um
of the
estilo e
social
uma
bond
forma de
between
relação típica
psychanalysts,
das
a style
democracias
and a form
populares.
of relationship
Em
typical of
Psicanálise e
popular
Medicina, de
democracy.
66,
In
ele diz que não se
Psychanalysis and
trata
Medicine
apenas
of
de democratizar o ensino da
1966,
psicanálise,
he
mas de
says that
perguntar
it's not
qual
only about a
democracia
matter of
queremos.
democratizing the teaching of
E esta
psychoanalysis,
pergunta
but of
que
asking
nos
what
tira
democracy
o
do we
que
want? And these
evita a
questions which
tirania.
that is
Lembremos
one
que os
that avoids
processos de
tyranny.
Praga são o
Let's
sintoma
remember
da
that the
inversão da
process of
democracia em
Prague
tirania,
are
com a
symptoms
consequente
of
segregação de
reversal
traidores,
of democracy
estrangeiros e
into
demais
tyranny,
figuras
the
que estão em
consequent
excesso
segregation
no
of
mundo.
traitors, foreigners, and other excessive figures
Confirma-se
of the
assim a
world.
tese
This
que,
confirms
depois
the
da
thesis
assimilação
that
democrática
after
de
the
novas
democratic
formas de vida,
assimilations of new
sobrevém a
forms of
tirania,
life,
processo que
tyranny
parece
has
valer
come to be
também para a nossa
overcome,
pequena
a process that seems to
comunidade,
be valid also for
colocando
a
em seu
small
horizonte
community of
suas condições de
psychanalysts,
generalização
placing
e de
its condition of
universalização.
generalization and
Podemos
universalization on
localizar
its
esse
horizon.
processo de assimilação e
We
inversão
can
na
locate
situação
this
atual do
process of
Brasil,
assimilation and
de
inversion
França,
in the current
mas também na
situation of
eleição de
Brazil
Trump nos
and
Estados
France,
Unidos.
but also in the election of
O
Trump
Brasil
in the
viveu um
United
período de
States.
20 anos
Brazil
marcado
have
por
lived a
progressos
period of 20 years
substanciais na
period marked
inclusão
by
de novos
substantial
sujeitos
progress in
políticos.
including new
A
political
formação
subject,
da nova
the
classe
formation
trabalhadora,
of the new
diminuição da
worker
fome e da
class,
miséria,
the reduction
uma
of
face desse
hunger,
processo.
and a face of the
Mas também se
process.
poderia indicar
But it could
desenvolvimento
also
inclusivo
indicate the
do
development
terceiro
of the
setor,
third sector,
expansão das
on the
políticas públicas de
or the expansion
inclusão
of public
escolar, de
policies of
redução de opressão de gênero,
inclusion,
classe
reduction of
e
oppression,
raça.
of gender,
Algo
race and
análogo
class.
parece ter se dado no terreno francês, com a
Something
chegada de
similar
novos
seems
grupos
to
de
have
imigrantes
taken place
e
in
com os
French
efeitos
soil with the
demográficos
arrival
e
of new
econômicos da
immigrant groups
implantação
and the
da União
demographic and
Europeia.
economic effects of the
Portanto,
deployment of the
confirmamos
European
o fenômeno
Union.
da
Therefore,
assimilação
we
com
confirm
suas
the phenomenon
consequentes,
of assimilation
com seu
with its consequent
consequente efeito de
aggression
agressivização de
effect,
relações.
aggression
Mas
of relations.
isso não é condição
But this
necessária
is
e
not a
suficiente
necessary and
para a
sufficient condition
fetichização da
for the
excepcionalidade e a inversão da
fetishization of
democracia em tirania,
exceptionality and
o que
reverse of
também se
democracy
anuncia
into
fortemente
tyranny,
nos dois
which is also
contextos.
strongly announced in both
Faltaria
contexts.
localizar, então, o fenômeno da
It would be
redução
missing
dos
to locate the
indivíduos aos seus
phenomenon of the
números
reduction of
ordinais e ao
individuals
ato
to ordinal cardinal number and to cardinal
Nas
act.
democracias
In
modernas,
modern
a
democracy,
ordinalidade pode ser
ordinality can be
traduzida pelo
translated
reconhecimento
by
das
the
diferenças
recognition
individuais,
of individual
enquanto que a
differences,
cardinalidade
while
é expressa pelo
cardinality is
ato do voto
expressed by the
e
act of
nas
voting
demais formas de
and in the
participação
other
direta
forms of
no poder.
direct participation participation in power.
Mas o que seria então o ato cardinal
But
nos
what would be
equivalentes
then the
modernos da
cardinal act
tirania?
in the modern equivalents of
E tenho aqui a
tyranny?
observação lateral de que
Here
a
I note a
diferença
lateral observation
tirânica
that the
interna aos
tyrannical
estados da
difference
democracia,
internal to the
antes de sua
states of
inversão em
democracy
tirania como
before
método
its
de Estado, de
inversion
governo,
of tyranny
é
as
melhor
a state
percebida pela
method
figura
or
do
government method
estrangeiro.
is better
Ora,
perceived in the
uma maneira de
figure of the
pensar o
foreigner.
sistema de classificação
Now,
ordinal
one way of
próprio de
thinking
nossa
the
época
ordinal
é imaginá-lo
classification
como a
system of our time is to
institucionalização do
imagine it with the
totemismo, com sua lógica
institutionalization of
incorporativa,
totemism,
com sua
its
política de colonização,
incorporative logic,
com sua
its
dominação
colonization
predatória da
policy,
natureza
its
e
predatory
com a sua
domination of
sexuação
nature,
em
and
gêneros
its sexuation in
ininteligíveis,
intelligible
conforme a
genders,
exposição crítica
as the
da Monique
critical
Bernard hoje de
explanation by
manhã.
Monique Bernard this
Recorro
morning.
aqui ao filósofo e
I
psicanalista
refer here
Guillaume
to a
Silbertin
philosopher
Blanc,
and
que tem
psychoanalyst
pesquisado
Guillaume
novas
Silbertin,
antropologias
who
para a
has
psicanálise
researched
a partir
new
dos achados de
anthropologies for
Merlin Stratton
psychoanalysis based on
e
the
da
findings
contra-antropologia
of
melanésia
Stratton and
e
the
também de Viveiros e Castro,
and of
que nos trouxe
Viver
uma
de
crítica
Castro, who has
pertinente e
brought
produtiva
our pertinent
do
criticism
totemismo,
of
inclusive do totemismo
and also
psicanalítico.
of psychoanalytic totemism.
Cito Silbertin. O
I
pensamento
quote
psicanalítico não
Silbertin,
pode ter uma
thinking
eficácia
cannot
crítica,
have
a
critical
não ser
efficacy,
sobre a condição de se
except
deixar
under the
afetar
condition
por
of letting
outras
itself be
antropologias
affected by other
ou por antropologias
or
outras. Ou, para
anthropologies
formular
others,
ainda de outro
or
modo, sobre a
in
condição
order
de
to
que o
formulate
pensamento
in a different
psicanalítico
way,
leve a cabo
under the
isso que
condition that
faz com que ele
psychoanalytic
seja
thought
incisivo.
carries out what makes it
Extrair todas as
incisive.
consequências
That is to
da heteronomia
to
do
draw all the
pensamento,
consequences of the
se deixando
heteronomy
ensinar
of
por
thought,
pensamentos
letting
não
itself
menos
be taught by
estrangeiros
thoughts
que
no less
aqueles do
foreign
desejo
than
inconsciente.
those of unconscious desire.
Portanto, estamos às voltas com uma espécie de
End quote.
democracia
So
estrangeira,
therefore, this foreign
animista
democracy
e ainda
may
assim
allow for
universalista,
translation of the logic of
que
the
talvez
known
permita uma
whole.
tradução lógica
It
do que
may
Lacan chama
allow a
de não todo
logic
e dos seus efeitos políticos
translation
em algo como
of
uma
its politics
democracia não
effect into
toda.
something
Uma
as
democracia
an
que consiga se
incomplete
prevenir
democracy
contra
by
o fascínio pela
extensions,
totalidade.
which can
Quero dizer
prevent
com
itself
isso,
against the
não uma
fascination
democracia
for
incompleta por
totalitarity.
exceções,
I'm not
muros,
talking
dispositivos
about
de segregação,
an incomplete
mas uma
democracy by
democracia que
exemptions,
possa criar
walls and
outro
devices
futuro
of
por vir,
segregation, but a democracy that
indeterminado.
can create another
E com
future
isso,
to
outro
come,
tipo de
and
infinito,
with
não
it,
fechado.
another kind of infinity,
Trago aqui a
not
hipótese que
closed.
desenvolvi em meu livro sobre o mal-estar,
Now I'm going
sofrimento e
to talk
sintoma,
about the hypothesis
de
that
que
I
o
have
sucedâneo
developed in my
atual
book,
e embrionário das tiranias
mal-estar,
é esta
suffering and
forma de
symptom,
vida que se estrutura
that
ao modo de
current and embryonic
condomínios.
substitute for
Seu
tyranny
elemento
is the
fundamental são
condominium
os
life form.
muros,
Its
os
fundamental
síndicos e as
elements are the
patologias da
walls,
identidade.
the apartment manager, and the
O muro é uma
pathologies
função de
of
segregação que
identity.
suspende a demanda
The
e a lógica do
wall is a
reconhecimento do
segregation
outro,
function that
tornando sua
suspends the
face
demand and
invisível,
recognition
instituindo a
logic
paranoia
of the other,
sistêmica como
making its
gramática
face
fundamental de
invisible,
reconhecimento.
instituting
E o
systemic
medo como
paranoia as a
afeto,
grammar
ele é
of
consoante.
recognition and fear
O
as
síndico
affection.
é essa figura de autoridade
The
representada pelo
janitor,
gestor das
the apartment
leis,
manager, is
o
the authority
administrador das
figure
regras,
represented by the law
que cria
manager, the
exceção
rule
para produzir a
manager,
regra.
who creates the
As
exception to
patologias do
produce
condomínio são
rules.
deduzidas
The
desse
pathologies
espaço
of
de
condominium
simulação
are
da
deduced from
democracia,
this
no
space
qual
of
traço
simulation
de
of democracy
identidade
in which
expande o
a trace
narcisismo
of
das pequenas
identity
diferenças,
expand
a
narcissism
estrela,
of
o
small
recordista,
differences,
o excepcional,
of great
ao
in
ponto de
narcissism like the
traduzir essas pequenas
stars, the
diferenças
sportsman,
num
the
narcisismo
entrepreneur,
de grandes
into
diferenças.
translating this difference in
Nesse
a
tipo de laço
narcissism
social,
of great
poder e
differences.
autoridade se fundem em uma
Power and
espécie de palavra que
authorities
fala
then
por si
merge in a
mesma,
sort
de
of
palavra
word
de
that
ordem,
talks by
que não pede
itself, like
justificativa ou razão,
word
mas que
order that
legifera.
has
grita.
no justification
Esta
or
forma de
reason.
palavra, Lacan chama
This
também
sort of
de
word
significante
Lacan
mestre.
calls master
Temos então
signifier.
uma montagem
We have
discursiva
then
onde o muro
a discursive
funciona como um significante
assemblage
mestre no
where the
lugar de
wall
agente, tal como o
functions
discurso
as
Lacan
the
qualificou
master,
assim.
such as a
O
discourse.
síndico
as
corresponde ao
according to
significante
Lacan.
mestre no
The
lugar de uma
apartment
verdade,
manager is
como
then
no
the
discurso
master
universitário,
of
que
a truth,
administra
such as
a
the
verdade.
universal discourse,
O
administering
sofrimento
truth.
segregativo dentro e fora dos
The
muros nos
suffering
mostra o
inside and
significante
outside the
mestre no
walls
lugar do outro,
shows
tal
this
como vemos no
master in the
discurso
place of the
deste
other, as we saw
Lembramos
in
que
the
os
discourse
discursos definem-se
of
por um
Estelin.
ordenamento
The
fechado.
discourses are
né?
defined by
Sempre,
closed
sempre nessa
ordering,
ordem.
always,
Significante mestre,
always
significante
in this,
saber,
in this
sujeito,
way.
objeto.
Subject,
Temos
object,
então
master,
o
significant,
que pode nos
significant
ajudar a
to know.
entender o que é a condição de
we want to
ordem,
understand what is the
ordem dos
order
discursos,
condition,
para falar com Foucault.
order of the listening,
O
according
ato
to
de
Foucault.
cardinalidade, ou
The
seja, o
act
ato que
of
reduz os
cardinality
indivíduos à amontoados, definidos por traços, onde a ordem não conta, é o ato que institui espaço público, reduz o espaço público a, por exemplo, um condomínio. No Brasil, é o que chamamos e vimos como o golpe parlamentar. onde, em nome do combate à corrupção, se legitima a corrupção dentro da lei. Nos Estados Unidos, temos o exemplo declarado do muro elevado à condição de política de Estado. Na França, os muros ainda estão em discussão na complexa rede de problemas envolvendo refugiados e apátridas. Mas os campos já estão se formando. Em Gaza, os muros já são uma política há mais de 20 anos. Isso, por si só, representa um problema político que convida a repensar a lógica de reconhecimento que comandou as democracias ocidentais até o momento. Isso requer um novo conceito de representação, bem como a reconstrução da noção política da experiência da universalidade, que é um traço imanente ao conceito de democracia. A hipótese da vida em forma de condomínio permite ler alguns fenômenos sociais concernentes à democracia no espaço das cidades, suas atuais condições circulação, notadamente a partir dos anos 70. O condomínio é uma formação topologicamente regressiva, ou seja, uma habitação do espaço em forma de cosmos, ou de esfera. Como costumam pensar as excepcionalidades e as elites. Ou seja, o macrocosmos é apenas um reflexo simétrico do microcosmos. O universal é apenas a generalização do particular. Contudo, nossa situação não comporta mais essa separação concêntrica. Nossas relações entre espaço público e espaço privado têm uma outra estrutura onde exterior e interior se comunicam, talvez conforme a hipótese lacaniana da garrafa de Klein. O condomínio e suas estruturas análogas com as prisões, os shopping centers, as favelas, são exemplos de uma forma de vida particular que por si mesmo corresponde a uma organização ordinal como outras. Convém então perguntar o que teria acontecido para que esse modo de subjetivação, esse tipo de relação particular com a lei, tenha sido erigido em máxima política e negação fundamental da democracia. Como esta forma de estar no espaço e de possuir coisas, objetos, veio a se tornar o modelo da nossa tirania contemporânea. Recorro aqui à leitura de Nancy Fraser sobre a ascensão de Trump ao governo dos Estados Unidos. No entender dela, Trump e seus muros tornaram-se possíveis em função do esgotamento de uma certa aliança entre o neoliberalismo econômico e as tendências progressistas que galgaram ganhos em termos de empoderamento de minorias, meritocracia e redução da opressão de raça e gênero. Nos últimos 30 anos, formou-se assim uma espécie de neoliberalismo progressista, que colocou mulheres talentosas e menos de discriminação no poder. Mas isso não engendrou o que ela chama, Nancy Fraser, de verdadeira esquerda. Entre os neoliberais progressistas, de Clinton e Obama, e o populismo reacionário, prevaleceu o que Rancière chamou de cansaço da democracia. Sorry. Would you...
It's okay.
Do you want to repeat this?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Recorro aqui.
I'll go back.
Okay. You got it?
Yes.
Recorro aqui.
So,
a leitura.
I'm going to talk about
Fraser,
the reading that Nancy Fraser
got it? Fez da ascensão de Trump.
It's about the ascension of Trump to the government of the United States, to his rise. According to her, Trump and his walls have become possible because of the exhaustion of a certain alliance between economic neoliberalism and the progressive tendencies that have leaped gains in terms of minority empowerment, meritocracy, and reduction of the oppression of race and gender. In the last 30 years, a progressive neoliberalism emerged and has brought talented women and less discrimination into power, but it has not entered what it calls the true left. Between Clinton's and Obama progressive neoliberalism and reactionary populism prevailed what Rancière calls the weariness of democracy.
Se há uma democracia que parece
Ends
terminar,
of neoliberal
chegando então ao
democracy,
seu fim,
if
seu
there is a
esgotamento,
democracy that seems to
ela é
end,
certamente uma
finding
democracia
it an
neoliberal.
end as exhaustion, it is certainly a neoliberal democracy. This progressive that developed in the 70s came along with a new arrangement. Let's call that the first experience of the implementation of neoliberalism as a state policy occurred in Chile after the coup that led Pinochet to power in September 1973. After that, there is no more areas reserved in the economy. Education, health, culture, or social assistance to the state should be minimal, and government intervention could accentuate the efficiency and impartiality of the market. According to what we have researched in our university's lab, it's also contemporary of a different rationality or nationality. There is a new manner to produce and generate goods, and also managing suffering. Robert Spitzer, he takes over the leadership, this penal code. It was published in the 70s, this psychiatric diagnosis of amid the criticism of human rights, movements in the gay movement, contestation regarding the status of perversion. Let's remember that although practiced from the 70s, neoliberalism was thought of as a reaction to tyranny in the 40s. In the famous Paris Congress that got together Hayek, von Mises, and Lippmann, we found the declaration of this program. I'm going to go back to the 40s and 70s. This declaration says the values of civilization are in danger. The group, this neoliberal group, maintains that these developments have been promoted by the rise of a conception of history that denies all absolute moral standards. It's a threat. Deny these moral standards and theories that question the desirable character of the rule of law. This right. He also argues, it's still a declaration of this group, that this development have been promoted by a decline in the belief in private property. And then the problem is that we believe less in the private property in the 40s. And then in the competitive market. Because without the diffuse power and the initiative associated with these institutions, it's difficult to imagine a society that can effectively preserve the freedom. I highlight here this idea of preserving the freedoms. It's just important to preserve freedom. Let's observe here the 4 features of denial of democracy in this Cardinal Act described by Lacan. The rhetoric that this transformation is a threat indicated by its aggressive totality. The history used to suppose this theory used to ratify that right. Private property and the competitive market considered as institutions as a meta institution or as meta institutions finally praise the preservation of freedom as if it were given and as if our greatest concern was the danger of losing it. Here is condensated the Greek discourse that allowed the choice of tyranny, that is the situation of war or epidemics, the external or internal threat. Let's go back to the 70s. A year before the first neoliberal experience, in May 72, Lacan made his conference in Milan. There was a corruption in the order that defines the discourse, that is a very closed order. There is a Cardinal Act that will withdraw and interrupt the rank of significant masters. This subversion of written may be some mistake of Lacan that this inverted when the person is part of the discourse. Would it be possible then in this act that of this capitalist discourse that far from being as the capitalism was another different story, in the 72, a year before, in the 70s, also 73,
Seria possível ler,
Would it
então,
be
o discurso
possible
capitalista
to
não como
have
estudo
this
universal para
capitalist
todas as formas do
discourse
capitalismo,
having different
especificamente
manners of
capitalismo
capitalists,
neoliberal, que
but
enquanto
the neoliberal one,
realidade histórica,
as a
dos anos
historic
70,
reality
e
in
ao
the
qual
70s,
parece encontrou um ponto
maybe
de nova
has
torção
found
em
new twist
2016.
point in
O discurso
2016.
capitalista em Lacan
This
corresponde ao caso
discourse in
teórico que
Lacan
procurava
corresponds in the
ilustrar
case
como
of
sistema
Lacan to
original
show
pode
how
ter seus
this
elementos
Cardinal
lidos
Act
por ato
can
cardinal.
have this
Isso
kind of
explica a
discourse.
ligação
It is
direta
explained
que
the
ocorre
direct
nesse
connection
discurso
between
entre o sujeito e o
object
objeto,
and subject
como eixo
as the
econômico do
economic
neoliberalismo em
axis
convivência
of
circular,
neoliberalism
com
is
outra ligação
coexistence
direta entre o
with another
significante
direct
mestre e o
link between the
significante
master
saber, ou seja, seu eixo
significant. This should be
comportamental.
the behavior axis
Ou seja, uma
expressed
certa conexão
by policies of
ativa
identity,
entre o sujeito
whether
e o objeto,
they are left or
expresso pelas
right,
biopolíticas de identidade,
and also
sejam
this
elas de esquerda ou de
identity
direita,
can be
liga-se
from the
com uma
right, from the
conexão
left,
segregatória
and there is
em
a
termos
connection in
econômicos.
terms of economics.
Esse é o diagnóstico
This
que precisamos
diagnosis that we have to
Esse é o
face now.
diagnóstico que
This is
Nancy
diagnosis
Fraser
that Nancy
recapitulou em
Fraser
seus próprios
has
termos.
recapped in her text.
Contra isso, é preciso
Against
reconfigurar
that, we must
o que Laval e
reconfigure
Dardot chamam de experiência
what
do
we
comum.
call a different
Seja
experience.
esse público
So
não é estatal,
this public,
esse
this
privado que não é o
state, this
mercado.
private, or
É
different
preciso
from the
reverter
market.
o
It's
isolamento
important to
entre a
revert
aceleração do
the
consumo,
isolation
os
of
seus efeitos
consumption
nos sistemas de
effects and
produção
also the
e
production
ligação com
system
modalidades de
and the
identidade.
connection with the modernity
Só
and
assim
identity.
poderemos
Only
defender
then
uma
we can
espécie de
defend
política
a kind of
da
policy
contingência
that will
ou da
have some
indiferença.
contingency or indifference.
Nenhum sujeito se
There is not a person that will define himself having his
no que toca à
pleasure,
subscrição
what it
aos
has
laços
to do
discursivos
with
do
the
espaço
ties
público.
that we will build
Quem
with
será
the world.
objeto
He
de
will
uma
not be the
desigualdade
object
social
of a social inequality,
naturalizada por tal
naturalized,
coisa como
having
déficit
these
orçamentário.
aspects.
Se essa leitura procede,
If this
ela nos
reading
ajuda a
is true,
detectar
it helps us to
problema na
detect a
psicanálise,
problem in the
filosofia política.
psychoanalysis and also
Ou seja,
political
a
psychology,
dependência
the
para
dependence
com a antropologia
in
para
the
com a
anthropology
filosofia da história,
with the philosophy
tornando
of history.
possível
So
a
it makes
eficácia dessa
possible the
interpretação.
efficacy of
Teremos,
this
então, como
interpretation. We are
tarefa
going to
pensar
have as a
que tipo de
task to
política,
think what kind of
ou seja, que
policy,
tipo de
what kind
democracia
of democracy
queremos.
that we want
Podemos
to
pensar
follow.
de forma a
Should we
reverter
think
de modo
to
sincrônico
revert
essas
in a
duas
synchronic
conexões.
manner these
O
two
ordenamento
connections,
neoliberal do
this
gozo
new
e o
liberal of
ordenamento
pleasure
neoliberal
and
do
this
narcisismo.
neoliberal of the narcissism? That is it. Thank you.
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. Okay. So, well, I'm going to present this paper that the title is 7 Theses on Populism, Some Aspects to Debate. So, first thesis. To study populism, we need a first gesture, to leave aside prejudice and intellectual laziness. This usually would be an obvious statement in any other research, but in the case of populism, I'm afraid it is not. Populism seems to be the curse word in the political lexicon. It is the word where the contempt of many of the academics, journalists, and politicians from the right to the left-wing political scope converge. Usually, this common deprecation associates populism with what is considered to be vulgar, aesthetically ugly, morally wrong, with the lack of civic culture and respect for institutions, with what annoys the political correctness and reasonability, with authoritarianism, demagogy, corruption, and post-truth, among others. This is the reason why we should not be surprised when we hear in the mass media that this word is used in a pejorative way to vilify a government, a political party, or to describe the personality of any politician or leader. Or when we find that within the political arena, politicians use it as a gun to discredit an adversary. And also, within the academic field, it easily drags academics towards normative sermons. If we do not take all these prejudice views for granted, immediately we can say that if populism provokes such an aversion, it is because there is something to be considered. Maybe It has to do with its political potency. I prefer to take the pass in this paper and follow the way opened by researchers such as Peter Worsley and Margaret Canavan, whose works constitute a bi-level background for thinking populism free from prejudice, bringing to the surface the complexity of its relation to democracy. These authors had a different perspective on linking the concept of populism with democracy, this time without taking for granted that populism were a threat to democracy or some kind of deviation. And I also, and mainly, lean on the work of Ernesto Laclau, as you will hear, thanks to whom the term populism acquired a consummated theoretical status and pushed us to seriously rethink not only its relation with democracy, but with politics itself. Laclau's effort was to rescue populism from the marginal and contemptible position where, according to him, it has been confined by the dominant discourses of philosophy and social sciences from Plato to present days. He stated, "What is involved in such a disdainful rejection is, I think, the dismissal of politics to court and the assertion that the management of community is the concern of an administrative power whose source of legitimacy is a proper knowledge of what a good community is." This has been, throughout the centuries, the discourse of political philosophy, first instituted by Plato. Populism was always linked to a dangerous excess, which puts the clear-cut modes of a rational community into question. So my task, as I conceived it, was to bring to light the specific logic inherent in that excess, and to argue that, far from corresponding to marginal phenomena, they are inscribed in the actual working of any communitarian space. That was Laclau on populist reason. Second thesis. Populism is an ineradicable element of politics. Therefore, instead of embracing the futile effort of trying to eliminate it, we will be much better off trying to create a left-wing populism. If we accept Laclau's statement that populism is not a marginal phenomenon, but it is inscribed in the actual working of any communitarian space, what we are also accepting is his thesis that populism is a constitutive dimension of politics. Laclau never accepted that politics was a mere subsystem, that is, that politics would just refer to the institutionalized forms of interchange. For Laclau, politics went far beyond that. There was also the political, which had a whole decisive dimension. The political meant the moment in which objectivity is shaped, that is to say, the political was understood as the moment of the constitution of reality as such. For Laclau, any community, order, objectivity, identity, or even universality is always politically instituted. And politically instituted meant, for him, hegemonically built. Because he considered that hegemony is the form of politics, and it implies the practice of articulation that is crossed by two particular logics, the one of the difference and the one of the equivalence, two logics. And if we consider the link between populism and politics, we find that Laclau understood politics as the practice of hegemony, or what is the same as the practice of articulation. And in his text on populist reason, he stated that populism was a form of the practice of hegemony. This apparent coincidence between populism and politics, sometimes even supported by Lacan himself, pushed some authors to affirm that Lacan's theory had three semantically overlapped terms: hegemony, politics, and populism, what would have brought more confusion to the concept of populism. On the contrary, from my perspective, I do not understand that there is a semantic overlap between politics and populism, but rather a contamination. The remarkable aspect is that every populist articulation implies an hegemonic articulation, and as such, it is crossed by these two logics, the equivalence and difference. These two logics cannot be coherently united, and both are constitutive of politics and populism. That is the reason why they contaminate each other. So once the notion of contamination is introduced, the possibility to delimitate conceptual areas or to delimitate any kind of a sphere as absolutely pure and pristine is excluded. Having said this, it is possible to even detect specific populist characteristics: the construction of the people that antagonistically dichotomizes the social space into two places of enunciations, and the emergence of a leader. But in any case, every selfhood from the beginning is always contaminated, altered by otherness. At this point, the Derridian figure of the spectre can be helpful to approach populism. For Derrida, the spectre is what haunts. It is what bursts into the safety of one's own home. It is what destabilizes the settled order. The spectre is what, at the same time, cannot be captured or comprehended or completely explained by the traditional scholar according to the parameters of pure rationality. In this way, it is impossible to understand politics as immune to this, as an immune sphere to the populist contamination. On the contrary, populism is what haunts and contaminates politics. That is the reason why populism is an inextricable part of it. The possibility of populism is inscribed in politics itself and cannot be exorcised. As one day it was for Marx, communism, for Lacan, populism is the spectre that haunts the capitalistic powers. Then my proposal is that instead of disavowing populism, we should better try to do something with this ineradicable dimension of politics. Because if we do nothing with it, or even if we embrace the useless effort of trying to eliminate it, then we leave it available for right-wing positions, and they do not deserve such a gift. Our call now is to create left-wing populism. Social democratic parties gave up acting antagonism by rejecting populism. They took for granted the right-wing life imposed by the overwhelming neoliberalism. And consequently, they embraced the so-called logic of consensus. They imposed neoliberal consensus, that is an oxymoron in its own terms, which implies an extreme institutionalism and the idea that it is possible to avoid antagonism. That is to say, they consider that every single demand can be absorbed by institutional forms. In other words, this is Lacan, they attempt to make the limits of the institutionalist discursive formation coincide with the limits of the community. And they denied the constitutive dislocation of every order, the possibility of eruption of antagonism, of the immersion of the subject, and the creation of equivalence. As a consequence, the Social Democrats left the populist dimension open to be taken by right-wing positions. Probably, this is what at least partially explains the emergence of Le Penism, Trump, and the entry of Nazis into German parliament. So, third thesis. In neoliberal context, as the one we are living today, populism can be, it's a possibility, the expression of emancipatory fights. I would like to bring up two examples that show how neoliberalism considers populism its main enemy. First, these are examples from Argentina. In the middle of the repression against the dismissed workers of the industrial facility of PepsiCo in Buenos Aires province in Argentina, a policeman told Nicolás del Caño, a Trotsky party leader who, by the way, has publicly stated that he does not like to be called a populist. The policeman told Nicolás del Caño, "Do not come here with populist activities." Nicolás del Caño was trying to dissuade policemen from repressing. Second, a day later, a mass media famous neoliberal economist, José Luis Espert, tweeted, "Companies hire people and also fire people. To work is not a right as the populist cavemen troglodyte think. To work is contingent." These examples give us a clue why it is so important to create a left-wing populism. Populism is the way of radical politics today because it is the figure of the people, the only one that can unleash changes in the status quo. It is the people, the plebs, that claims to be the only legitimate populace, that parties assume the representation of the whole, the figure that can push radical political process today. The people is a key figure, but why? Because it escapes the subjective emplacement of neoliberalism. If capitalist discourse in its neoliberal version, and I'm taking this from Jorge Alemán, an Argentinian psychoanalyst, if capitalist discourse in its neoliberal version attempts and has the potency to cover and dominate it all, the people is that figure that expresses the impossibility of that very attempt. In other words, the people constitutes itself as around the impossibility of society, this metaphor that Lacan brought in Hegemony and Social Strategy. If society could close itself as a coherent, unified order without dislocations, then the possibility of any figurality will be cancelled, and consequently the possibility of the people, of hegemony, and also of antagonism. The people shows that impossibility when it articulates itself by filtering and immersion in the discursive space through the interstices of the assigned places, the given hierarchies, and the settled functions that neoliberal subjectivity imposes, and thereby questioning what has been determined as important, as prior, as visible, and existent. In this sense, the people is already a kind of inscription of antagonism as long as it expresses it. Let us say the people invents, creates, or constructs itself. It is a political figure that does not derive from any precedent premise, not is a logical response to a political situation or a given context. The people of populism can never be thought as an empirical group, a sociologically established class, a demographic data, or the count of an electoral majority. Furthermore, the people escape the neoliberal metric. That is where its radical emancipatory potential lies. The people brings in its own shape equality. It is constitutively egalitarian. It is an egalitarian excess that disrupt the neoliberal meritocratic normative, the difference between winners and losers, and the inequality that the competition between humans capitals carries out, as Wendy Brown says. Every one of those who are part of the people is equal to each other. They are pares, regarding a leader who never stops being a primus inter pares, the first among equal. I'm going to return to the idea of the leader briefly. The people can only have a collective way. Therefore, it overflows the limits of individual responsibility, isolated or entrepreneurial of the self, that capture us within the neoliberal rationality and emplaces subjectivities. The people proposes to make a common cause with that emerges and has no foundation, ultima, literality, or cause, but emerges and by doing so shows the discontent with what has been dispossessed, with the emplaced or the status quo that becomes its enemy. That is to say, in the current times, the people establishes a frontier with individualistic logic that dominates the financial speculation and the unlimited consumption. The people is a way to interrupt the solitary jouissance as capitalism imposes in its neoliberal mode. Furthermore, in a left-wing populism, in a left-wing populism, the people is a political figure constructed that does not nullify particularities, not hegemonizes the social space. We do not find in the figure of the people either a close sense of totality, substantial or positive identity, given immanence, full pressure, or any ontological priority of any kind, and even less the possibility of the people as one. Contrary to the neoliberal pretension that tries to block any possible immersion of the subject, the people of populism incarnates it and holds the difference. Although in a populist articulation, the figure of the people is unique, as the dichotomized social space only allows one people, the people is always an hegemonic universality. That means that it comprises many different differences. That is to say, diverse demands can be articulated in the same figure of the people. At this point, I would like to mention that the debate within the radical politics field regarding the last Latin American populist style revolved mainly around whether these populists were true or fake alternatives to oppose neoliberalism. In this way to search emancipation. The two prominent positions within the radical field have something in common, their disdain towards populism. On the one hand, we have the traditional left that sticks to the basic Marxist arguments. That is to say, they remain with the idea that every political subject is a class subject and that there is a correspondence between the social class and certain social tasks. And on the other hand, we have the postmodern left that is aware that there is no such a political subject established a priori, and call to actualize a historical task, and consequently is obliged to think about the contingency and proposes alternatives such as nomadism and so on and so forth. In both cases, populisms are considered a flawed form of politics, a political form that surrenders the strategic anti-capitalistic aim. Then they regard populism as a minor, radical political expression that will not be able to achieve any kind of genuine emancipation. That is the reason why they consider populism as an imposture. For instance, Latin American populism were called the pink tide, a name that shows some sort of sympathy, but also certain contempt, because they were not red, they were just pink, a washed-out way, no? A washed-out version of the left. Then, time and again, they return to the same topics. Latin American populism could never get rid of the extractivist model. They could never cut the excessive dependence on the value commodities in the international market. They only promoted a distributive logic that triggered a consumerist effect, and so on and so forth. My response to this critique is that they completely lose sight of the fact that Latin American populisms incarnated their antagonism within the only discursive field available, which is, by the way, imposed by their enemy, capitalist neoliberalism. Could it be possible? Could it possibly be in any other way? Precisely, that is their paradox. Its destabilizing potential and its limits. Because how could a non-contaminated political intervention from a pure exteriority be? What would be the way to truly touch the capitalist edifice and banish neoliberalism completely? How would this true way to touch capitalism give account of the antagonism that necessarily emerges when you confront and affect neoliberalism? If populism are such a fake, why is it that for so many years the neoliberal elites tried with all the efforts and resources to exterminate them? Commitment that continues nowadays in the context of the neoliberal and conservative governments that we are suffering now. This government, in the case of Argentina, and I want to say this, are persecuting leaders of social and political organizations. They are repressing social protests. They are allowing the police to go inside schools and universities. They are putting press under pressure. We are having political prisoners in Argentina now. The obvious example is the indigenous community leader Milagro Sala. And we had an enforced disappearance. Santiago Maldonado, now his body has been found. Santiago Maldonado was protesting for a land dispute between Benetton, the guy of the clothes, between Benetton and the Mapuche community in the Patagonia. So they are doing all this on the off chance that one of the populist leaders win another election. So, for thesis. The people of populism is not the same as the Freudian mass. The temptation here could be that we have to insist on populism because it is the negative reverse of neoliberalism. If neoliberalism, as Wendy Brown stated, demolishes the promise of social democracy and relocates every element in economic terms, inclusion becomes competence, equality turns into inequality, freedom is understood only as a freedom of deregulated markets, and collective expressions such as the sovereign people will become hostile and has to be eliminated, then its counterface would be populism. However, I think that it would be a mistake to think populism in tandem with neoliberalism. Let us say in a binary opposition of the type neoliberalism, populism, where the first will represent the rational and differential organization of the spaces and hierarchies in an extreme institutionality, and the second will be the pure libidinal bond that makes the members of a crowd equivalent between one another, going behind a leader. Populism does not merely imply the formation of the people through the imaginary identification among the members of a mass by putting the same leader in the place of the idea. That is, the people is not the same as the Freudian mass, because the people also implies organization. Sorry, reading in English makes me thirsty. Five, populism do not imply an anti-statu quo impulse that threatens institutions. Populism populism also implies the production of institutions. Populism supposes an anti-statu quo or anti-institutional impulse, but this is just one aspect. Following Lacan, we can say that this anti-statu quo impulse is born from the experience of a lack that is linked to demands that are not met. There is a power which has not met the demands. We can also say that this anti-statu quo impulse is born from a series of torts that once they have provoked an extended frustration of demand, the request addressed to the institution may become a generalized claim against the institutional order itself. However, the experience of a tort, of a series of torts that implies this idea of the experience of a lack or being deficient, that involves the idea of that somebody is responsible for the absent plenitude of the community and therefore cannot be a legitimate part of the populace, is the key to unleash an emancipatory process. Of course, and I want to stress this, there is nothing guaranteed with this anti-statu quo impulse. It all depends on the correlation of forces of a given context where populism arises. Populism are completely linked to this anti-statu quo impulse and the frontier effect that it establishes. If the frontier disappears, the populist articulation disappears too. But this is just one aspect, because populism also produces institutions. The people, as I already mentioned, has plenty of organizations, let us say a whole diversity of social movements, from LGBT organization to the slum priest of the option of the poor, unions, organization of small-scale producer or small traders, political parties, etc. And also, populisms incarnate a counter-hegemonic will, and as such, they construct new institutions, or at least they attempt to construct new institutions. The task of any populism is to build a new hegemonic bloc, to institutionalize the changes they attempt to produce. I don't know if this is a proper academic argument, but I'll give two personal examples. Firstly, I study in a free public university. The idea of the access to the university as a right, as many other rights as a right, was established by a populist government, the terrible Peronism, the bad guys. And secondly, I married my companion, Clarissa, thanks to another populist articulation, Kirchnerism, that established the egalitarian marriage. So, to give examples. So, 6. The leader in a populist articulation is not the authoritarian father of the primal horde of Freud, neither someone who provokes a paralyzing hypnosis. Thank you. It is frequent to find that there is an intellectual aversion to the figure of the leader. It is usually based on the defense of an abstract and conceptual autonomy. Then, instead of having the person of a leader, we should have an idea in that place, for instance, the concept of communism or whatever. Let us say, a proper political formation should have a concept, probably institutionalized in a party, and the people defending or going for a concept. And leadership should be in a second stage. But as we all know, the leader has a very important place in any populist articulation. So in defense of leadership, I will briefly mention 3 aspects. First, even the most horizontal experience, either historical, theoretical, at a certain point had to appeal to a leader. 2 basic examples. Democracy in Athens, in its golden age, had a leader, such as Pericles. And Rousseau had to introduce the figure of the legislator in his social contract. Second, we can think of the figure of the leader following the Freudian metaphor of totem and taboo, to illustrate the beginning of culture. The authoritarian father of the primal horde has to be killed and eaten in order to constitute society and to have a leadership, the leadership reconfigured into a place, and then available to be occupied by any other of the brothers. But thus, once that the place of the leader has been constituted as such, anyone who occupies that place will always be one of the brothers, a primus inter pares, who will always be in the place of the father, but will never be the father. Moreover, he will always be threatened by the possibility of being assassinated by the brothers. However, if we follow Laclau's position, we should not consider the place of the leader as a mere neutral, empty space. If we do not want to consider only the formality of the institution of the place of the leader, which of course is very important, but we also want to take into account the community's whole political way of life, the politeia, we have to consider the mutual contamination between the occupier of the place of the leader and the nature of the place itself. Firstly, the leader, as the representative of a populist articulation, that is an hegemonic force, needs to present the partiality she or he represents as a universality, that is, a particularity which at some point assumes the representation of a totality which is incommensurable with it. And secondly, the place of the leader needs to have an embodiment. In Spanish we say, poner el cuerpo, to put the physical body in scene. In any case, somebody has to incarnate the people's wills, the assembly of the people, the idea, the concept, or the purpose. Third, there is something to be considered regarding the name of the leader and the performative dimension of naming. Laclau refers to the singularity that the name of the leader prints in the people, the assemblage of heterogeneous elements kept equivalentially together only by the name of the leader, he said, whose name becomes then the ground of the chain of equivalence. This is not the transparent, the name is not the transparent medium through which something which conceptually, fully, comprehensively shows itself. But to name a series of heterogeneous elements through the name of the leader as the people is a hegemonic operation that performatively brings about the unity of those elements. The name of the leader expresses the singularity of the people, and the singularity of that political formation has to do with a unique context of historical legacies and common inheritance. Therefore, the leader is a proof of the existence of the people, and is at the same time the result of a common invention that shows the constitutive and antagonistic structure of the political. That is why his or her proper name does not dominate the process of constructing the people. His or her name never coincides with the person who incarnates it. It is always crossed by tension that can never be synthesized in a complete way. 7, and to conclude, populism evokes militant interpellation. So if we go back to the idea of the emancipatory fact, the question is, does the people encompass the possibility of emancipatory fights? The answer is paradoxical. The people implies the experience of the possibility and also the impossibility of emancipation at the same time. How is this possible? I will take the Lacanian notion of lost causality in its double assertion. On the one hand, a cause that you have to defend or a cause that you have to win, and on the other, a cause as a ground, that is to say, as a foundation. Then, in the first case, a cause as something that you have to defend or achieve, the case will always be a failure because even in the best of the cases, it will never be fully realized as such. That's impossible. And in the second case, the cause as a ground or a foundation, we mean that it is a lost cause because, contrary to what is being taught at the university, if the cause is taken away, its effect will disappear. Here, in this case, we have that there are effects because there is no cause. The double assertion of low causality means that neither starting points nor finishing lines are guaranteed because there are no grounds from where to start from or take any ultimate signification. And there are no final goals established a priori to be fully achieved. However, lost causality as a function of the impossible does not involve impotence, paralysis, or renouncement. On the contrary, it involves an experience that tries to turn the absent ground into a cause. In front of a lost causality, something will always be missing, something will always be in excess. In other words, there will always be the real insisting, that which never stops not being written, as Lacan says. Finally, in this lack of guarantees, it is this lack of guarantees what evokes a call to become involved in political struggles. It evokes an ethical position because as nothing is guaranteed beforehand, as we do not know how things are going to turn up, as the political orientation of a populist articulation depends on the correlation of forces in a given context, as we do not know what the incessant eruption of the real may generate in the symbolic and imaginary orders, as antagonism is inextricable, it is because of all those things that we have a call to become militant. The people implies politics, a possibility to experience the possibility of emancipation. And I want to insist, this must not be taken as a mean of summon to resignation from impotence, but quite the contrary, as a call from the impossible to become involved in political fightings to the subjective responsibility of building a people. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, so I would like to thank both our speakers for a very thought-provoking papers, and I have a very difficult task here. I am the one who's going to speak the last. You're going to speak after me, right? Please, okay. But I feel, right, thank you. But I feel that, in a way, this session did summarize some of the arguments that have been sort of discussed in explicit or implicit ways throughout this conference. And it would be great if I can, I'm not promising that, but if I can try to sort of, highlight these as well as speaking to you, if you allow me to. Yeah. So, this panel addresses the concerns of the conference by proposing two diagnostic representations of the crisis of democracy, as the crisis of democracy anyways was one of the themes, and the title already indicated it was one of the themes that came up, but I guess we are differing in how to diagnose this crisis. And the two papers were addressing a crisis, but in different ways again, right? But both challenged the conventional ways in which the notion and practice of populism is framed, and the predominant construal of democracy and tyranny as being each mutually exclusive, constitutes our theoretical horizon. So they actually do pose challenges, theoretical challenges. Both papers base their critique of contemporary democracy on the denial of a politics of difference. But instead of the more facile position of constructing binaries, both face up to the tensions underlying certain iconized or reified notions of democracy. So they actually do problematize democracy at the same time, right? As Nietzsche said, they invite us to gaze into the abyss without allowing the abyss to gaze back at us, and I thank you for doing that. Yeah. But the two papers seem to be radically opposed to each other, in that the practice of populism enunciated by Paula would require suture and the condensation of part of the population into the figure of the people, right, represented by a leader, whereas, if I read you correctly, Christian, what you seem to diagnose as the pathology of democracy is exactly that kind of practice which you call the Cardinal Act, the generalization of a portion of the people into the representation of the people. So I see a tension between your papers. Without taking up too much of our time, because it's the third day and we're all somewhat tired, I would like to add my own thoughts to some of the arguments you made and also start formulating possible questions and points for further discussion. Well, I begin with Paula. I hear in your paper the intention to offset the negative effects of a certain reductionism that consists of disregarding the differences between left and right populism, right? A populism putting Chavez, Lula, and Morales in the same basket as Le Pen, Trump, and Erdogan, Orban, you name it. And you make a powerful case against this reduction that not only stifles debates concerning the political, economic, and social alternatives devised by left-wing populist leaders in Latin America, right? And we can also maybe add other southern European leaders like Tsipras and Iglesias here. So this reduction stifles debates as to their propositions, but also it also amounts to the neutralization of politics because it sort of eradicates or avoids, tries to avoid the antagonistic sort of dimension of hegemony that you were mentioning and of populism. So the desire to camouflage the antagonistic moment under technocratic and institutional proceduralism is likely to have led to the right-wing backlash that we are experiencing today, as you maintain. The invitation to rethink populism, or rather, to delink it from its pejorative connotations, is an invitation to squarely face up to the gap that is constitutive of politics. So instead of codifying populism as a form of irrationality that is then judged and denounced from the point of view of an ideal politics, you know, a politics that is rational and consensual, which is the, the sort of like the liberal ideal of politics, you urge us to come to terms with the fact that any communitarian space would have to be constructed through hegemonic and through populist processes. You also make a strong claim in favor of populist imaginaries by arguing that they stand in a potentially antagonistic relation to neoliberalism. So evoking the figure of the people, you argue, disrupts neoliberal metrics of inequality, atomization, because it is constitutively egalitarian. And your challenge builds upon, of course, Ernesto Laclau's re-evaluation of populism, the context of which is the same as yours, namely Latin America. I nevertheless have a couple of concerns regarding your position. In keeping with the aims of this conference and also of the project of developing a critical theory beyond the confines of Europe, we must pose two sets of questions regarding this arguably very ambiguous term populism. I remember yesterday's discussion, right? I think it's good that we discuss it, but I propose that we think of a set of theoretical and a set of more contextual, practical questions when determining whether populism is emancipatory or not. So my first theoretical question concerns where populist discourse ends and politics begins according to your framework. Is politics always already populist? In which case, it becomes difficult to claim that populism is but a form of politics. If not, that is, if we can, however, impurely, not clearly, but impurely, messily, distinguish between a political and a populist moment in various modes of collective existence, how are we to conceive of the non-populist moment? Following up on this, I would also like to address to you the question Judith asked Vladimir yesterday. It was bound to come also. Is there a difference between populist struggles, populist politics, and popular struggles? Popular. No? Oh, sorry. Is there a difference between populism, populist politics, and popular struggles? Mm-hmm. A certain idea of the people might be the yoke against which, say, ethnic struggles such as the Kurdish one is constituted. Should we imperatively articulate ethnic, religious, or class differences under people as an empty signifier in order for the struggle to be emancipatory? Wouldn't people enclose us into the space of the nation-state, thus making it difficult to heed Balibar's recent suggestion that we build transnational counter-populisms, in which case, what is the empty signifier? That's going to be the nodal point, right? Will it be people again? Another challenge would be to distinguish between the notion of people and that of population. This distinction seems important to me because we have to re-evaluate populism within the context of neoliberal governmentality, which is not the context in which Lacan was writing, right? This is our question today. And neoliberal governmentality does not exclude processes of collectivization. Neoliberalism does construct non-agentic populations instead of peoples. I know population is a surface, it's passive, it's not the subject that is, the invocation of a subject that people might have. But populism, especially when it is condensed in the figure of a leader, cannot be assumed without further qualification to have as its object and effect a collective agent. It's not because the people is evoked that a collective subject will be created out of it, right? Because it is an invocation, it is an interpellation. But are we assuming that there is a people that is doing the agentic movement? Is there really collective subject in populism? Or are we talking about populations that are called into this subjective position, let's say, under a leader, in which case, well, for instance, the biopolitical notion of healthy populations versus unhealthy, corrupt, degenerate ones, like the evangelist attack here was pretending, could also become a hegemonic project. A construction of an antagonism around population, or a notion of non-agentic, individuals, could also be a hegemonic project, right? So does the people really represent an entity? Does it construct one? Is my question, I guess, right? From here, I'd like to reflect a bit more upon your construal of neoliberalism. Your argument is that antagonism is anathema to neoliberalism, since the latter is based on a technocratic consensus that evacuates social struggles. Many scholars, including me, would contest this. For one, even as an economic process of capital accumulation, isn't neoliberalism premised upon creative destruction, as David Harvey has convincingly shown? The outright destructive aspect took the form of military coups in the 70s and an exaggerated concern for security in the 1980s. So neoliberalism has, I am with you when you say it has de-articulated the antagonism, let's say, around class. But I don't think neoliberalism evacuates antagonisms. I think, on the contrary, it feeds from creating new antagonisms in the form of, let's say, constructing logics of equivalence whereby the free and civilized populations of the global north are imagined to be combating barbarians, terrorists, rapists, among other things, chain of equivalences, right? So in your opinion, with the fact that it is neoliberalism is based on a sinister and de-democratizing consensus, rule out the fact that it is a hegemony, and a very successful one at that, and thereby breeds antagonisms instead of dispersing them, you know? So I think this question of whether the continuity and the relationship between neoliberalism and right and left-wing populisms is an important one, and we need to sort of think more about how we can distinguish the left-wing, right, response to neoliberalism from the right-wing response. But having said this, I do immediately feel the need to underline how important it is to emphasize, as you do, that populism cannot be construed outside of the context of its emergence, perhaps. But then, perhaps the idea of developing a generic theory of populism that would be valid for the globe is something we should abandon totally. If populism is contextual, we will not arrive at a theory of populism that sort of sees it as either emancipatory or regressive. We should look at each different context. And you are right in saying we shouldn't, perhaps, dismiss the idea of populism. Europeans shouldn't dismiss the idea of populism just because their history has sort of produced a kind of populism that was horrific. But perhaps in Latin America or in the South, we shouldn't forget that that history does exist. And in the North, populisms, or in Turkey, or in other places, populisms are extremely regressive in your sense, Rahel. Okay, so that was that. Christian, I was both fascinated, intrigued, and bewildered by your analysis of forms of contemporary regression, I would say again. Your main claim is that democracy, which you beautifully characterize as isogoric, isonomic, and isocratic, may be reversed and inverted from within. That's what I read in your paper, right? You draw our attention to modern conditions that produce excessive enjoyment through figures of exceptionality that at the same time pathologically convert difference into distinction, and then hierarchy, hiatus, division, segregation, right? You trace this division and segregation in contemporary walled-in existences and condominiums. I find that very important. So instead of being open-ended, fluid, indeterminate, the polis subsumes individuals and desires under ordinals and cardinals, right? But the slippery slope between democracy and tyranny, if I read you correctly, begins with internal segregation, the driving of a rift between the haves and have-nots, and the Cardinal Act, right, that erects the specific and particular into the universal, which perhaps Paula would like to contest. But I really do see that there is a tension between your two positions there, right? The Platonic hypothesis that tyranny emerges from within democracy, reformulated by Lacan, is, I think, very intriguing as well. But perhaps there is something there that begins to worry me. And let me see if I can, sort of correctly identify or neatly identify my problem with this. First of all, within the Greek context, and we know Lacan didn't or wouldn't have meant that, but within the Greek context, democracy is not desirable anyway. In any case, political philosophers do not conceive of democracy as desirable. Democracy is a pathological form, right? So you're referring to the actual practice, Pericles and Solon, so the principles of actually existing Greek democracy, but not to Plato. Not to Plato. For Plato, democracy necessarily degenerates into tyranny. Right? So is your position, your narrative seems to sway between a historical narrative of malestar. I love that word. Yes, I don't think there's a corresponding word in English. Malaise is French, right? I love that word. But anyway, the historical narrative of malestar, and the assumption that there are stages of the corruption of democracy, such as there are stages in the formation of the psyche. So your narrative goes between some sort of ahistorical, right, construct of democracy in the psyche and a sort of historical narrative. Okay, that's the question. Because the two arguments have fundamentally different implications. The one would assume that there's something wrong with democracy, right? But perhaps you are assuming that there is a Western form of democracy, right, based on a particular anthropological model of society. So you want to bring in anthropology also, and that's how I read your suggestions. And this imposition of this model on heterogeneous groups or sites is what would pervert democracy. And that's what you call the sort of, the way in which democracy becomes assimilative, because I really didn't grasp that point. How does assimilation and democracy work together? Are we talking about modern democracies, in which case I see, but democracy in general I don't see, okay? Or maybe you are saying that democracy functions in a manner similar to the functioning of the unconscious, in which psychoanalysis would play the critical role of informing us of both its perversions and its antidotes, right? So asking the question in a more Lacanian manner, what would a democratic form of life be if we construe democracy as consisting of inclusionary practices that effectively prevent symbolic foreclosure through the Cardinal Act, right? What does anthropology contribute to our chances of reconceptualizing the symbolic and imaginary dimensions of the coexistence of differences? And how do we overcome the problem of translation? I guess this is also one of the problems that all of us need to think about. The problem of translation, not only from context to context, but from psychoanalysis to anthropology, from anthropology to political philosophy, from political philosophy to practice, right? And I think any critical theory should think and really seriously think about the ways in which, or the possibility of relating or doing this translation between theory and practice. So, thank you.
I'm going to suggest that Cristiano and Paula take a few moments to respond, and then I think we will have time for just about 2 questions, and then we have some summary statements and a farewell. So, would you like to?
It's better to speak Portuguese. Bom, queria agradecer muito.
Então, I'd like to thank very much, Zeynep, for your talk. It allows for some clarification, and it also met the main idea, the Cardinal, which is that of Cardinal Act. I would say that Cardinal Act has in its text of Lacan certain ambiguity, because it's also a moment of inversion of democracy into tyranny, as well as a moment of reinversion of tyranny into democracy. It is an idea that there would be some sort of contingency in this passage, and not a needed inversion from one to the other.
Isso teria que ver com o contexto mesmo inicial da ideia de que a gente precisaria repensar a noção de crime para além do Código Penal. Repensar a noção de crime como, no fundo, um tipo de exceção. Um tipo de exceção que envolve um mal-estar, que envolve uma indeterminação entre aquela exceção que é uma dissolução da lei reificada, que é uma transformação, né? E a exceção que é uma espécie de confirmação da regra, que é uma espécie de constituição da regra. E eu acho que aqui o modelo de Antígona, comentado pela Judith, mas também pelo Lacan, ele é um paradigma, né? Pensando aí na ideia de historicidade da democracia. Porque a gente pode ler Antígona como defensora de um particular, da sua família, mas a gente pode ler que naquela contingência, naquele crime, naquela exceção, estava contido um universal por vir. Um universal de que todos devemos ter direito ao funeral, todos devemos ter direito à memória, e mais, diria assim, que há algo que é recorrente nessa incidência, né, de uma exceção, de um crime que é, ao mesmo tempo, transformador, que é a experiência de sofrimento. Antígona estava às voltas com um sofrimento que a gente não conseguia determinar, né, qual que era a sua natureza. Então, essa ideia de que, de certa forma, a lei ela é contingente, mas ela tem uma espécie de fim, de telos, que é o telos assimilativo, quando a gente fala em democracia. Ou seja, é sempre a inclusão de mais sujeitos, é sempre a inclusão de mais formas de vida. Isso me parece uma constante na história dos conceitos de democracia. Você tem razão, não é um conceito que nasce como uma promessa consensual, mas ele vai se impondo a partir da modernidade como uma ideia que representa esse sentido assimilativo. Isso, a colocação do Lacan é de que esse momento assimilativo ele vai produzindo uma tensão, ele vai produzindo antagonismo, acho que a gente conversa com o Lacan também, e é da expansão desse antagonismo que se tem um primeiro sintoma social, que é certas particulares que são diferentes, que são excepcionalidades problemáticas, né? E um segundo movimento que é a passagem dessa excepcionalidade à tirania, né? Então, assim, eu não diria que há algo errado com a democracia, mas que a democracia ela comporta momentos de risco. Ela comporta momentos em que o ato ele não vai ser um ato garantido se ele é um ato, vamos dizer assim, que vai levar à democracia ou vai levar à tirania. Se ele vai levar ao popular ou ele vai levar ao populista. E esses momentos de risco é o que eu quis quis chamar a atenção para uma espécie de estrutura da democracia, em que de tempos em tempos a gente parece se confrontar com essa encruzilhada, com esse momento em que o conceito de ato, no sentido psicanalítico, ele é convocado, no sentido de aposta, de uma espécie de risco que não é calculável, e que a gente justamente poderia traduzir assim: ele é também o risco que faz a gente juntar certas estratégias com certas políticas, né? Ou certo conjunto de estratégias particulares com o que Lacan chamaria, não sei, de the political, a política. Né? Quer dizer, essa passagem, ela é crucial e ela depende de atos contingentes, de como a gente justamente pode definir ideologicamente o político como assim, dependendo de certas estratégias necessárias. Bom, isso é o que é ideológico. Esse é o conceito ideológico de democracia, porque ele diz para mim que eu já sei o que é a democracia e a estratégia A, B e C leva a esse fim. Né? Então, o que a minha comunicação tentou mostrar é que o título foi muito bem escolhido. Né? Fins da democracia, e a democracia como um projeto que tem fins, que tem momentos de expansão, que tem momentos de recuo, que tem momentos como esse que a gente vive e que talvez poderia ser pensado, né, com essa lógica temporal. Né? É um pouco como a lógica temporal do xiste. O xiste é um ato que subverte a comunidade que o tornou possível. Mas, por outro lado, um xiste ele é um instrumento, uma estratégia para a confirmação dos piores preconceitos, para a reafirmação dos piores, vamos dizer assim, excepcionalidades. Então, o engajamento na democracia, ele tem essa estrutura de um xiste, de uma aposta. Né? Essa assimilação, eu acho que a gente discutiu bastante aqui no nosso encontro, eu acho que é o ponto de entrada para a discussão antropológica. Né? Porque a gente pode pensar, então, duas estratégias de assimilação de mais pessoas no universo, ou de mais sujeitos no universo democrático. Uma forma canibal totemista, em que foi própria da colonização. Né? De trazer mais almas, de trazer mais, de se apossar de mais indivíduos, de mais trabalhadores, de mais mão de obra. Enfim, isso é uma maneira de pensar essa expansão. Né? Expansão como, por exemplo, inclusão no mercado. Outra plataforma. Contra esse modelo canibal incorporativo, troquista, vamos dizer assim, predatório, que me parece interessante recorrer a antropologias que vão dizer que ele não é necessário. Ele é um modelo contingente, porque a gente teria modalidades de aquisição ou de canibalização que não são identitaristas, que não são acumulacionistas, e que são essas que a gente está associando com um animismo perspectivista, ou que a gente poderia assimilar com uma certa estratégia lacaniana, do ato e do luto, ou da dissolução do eu, ou da dissolução ou travessia do fantasia. Bom, vários temas que acabam remetendo a isso. Bom, sorry.
But let's let Paula. I'm aware this could be a much longer conversation, and I'm sorry to cut you short.
Well, thank you, Zeynep, for your questions. I don't know if I can answer each of one very precisely, but I'll try to say something. You ask when does populism end, right? And I think they do end. And firstly, I think maybe one possibility is when the frontier of this dichotomization of the social space disappears. That's one possibility. The other possibility that I find is that, at least from the experience we had, is that there is like a kind of there's a gap between the moment of the populist eruption, the anti-status quo the institutionalization. I think that the problem with the populist movements, as we live in here, in Argentina, I don't know, here, probably you can say that, is that the moment of institutionalization can never reabsorb completely the moment of the eruption. So there's always a loss. And that's something that sooner or later destabilizes the populist governments. I think that demand slides, you know, they are never stuck, right? It's always sliding. So I think that's one of the aspects. So yes, they do finish. And you also ask, when do we, how do we conceive not populist movements? Yes, there are no populist movements. I think when we started this seminar, we were talking about this with Natalia, with the example of Ni Uno Menos. I don't know if you remember this case in Argentina. I think that's a very powerful movement, and I think it is not a populist movement. It doesn't have a clear leader. It doesn't have, it doesn't provoke a dichotomization of the social space. So I think that maybe that's kind of political formation, right? That is not a populist one, but maybe a popular one. I don't know. I have to think about this. You made me this question. So I don't know. Maybe this would be a good example to differentiate politics and popular struggles, right? And well, you also mentioned the idea of populisms are enclosed into nations, right? Tell me if I'm okay. Tell me if I'm okay with what I understood. Okay, so yes, in a sense, yes, because, well, demands are addressed to the states, right? So in a sense, yes, but I also think that it's not enough. And we were talking today with Susan, right, about the Porto Alegre experience, right? And that was kind of a precedent of this populist government, right? Many of those movements that participated in those gatherings later became part of these governments, you know, in Evo Morales and Kirchner and so on. And so there was a kind of solidarity between these political formations. And I think that, yes, we need something else, to think this other dimension, not only enclosed to the nation state. But from my point of view, still the nation state has a very important place, because it's not the same to have a state governed by the left-wing populism that, in a way, with all the difficulties and limits, tries to make of the state a place for the inscription of emancipatory demands, than the state governed, for instance, as we are suffering now in Argentina, of a neoliberal, conservative, and authoritarian government that is repressing us, you know. So I think the state still has a very important place. So, and finally, you say that neoliberalism creates antagonism, right? And I don't know, I'm not sure. It's hard for me to agree with this, because I think that what neoliberalism tries is to avoid antagonism, to block it. They don't want the emergence of the subject, the eruption of the unconscious. They want to block it, you know? And they in place the individuals in the solitary jouissance, you know, isolated. So there is a malaise, a very strong malaise, but it's an individual malaise. So you find people going to all these, how you say, terapias alternativas, how you say that, alternative therapies, like, no, you go and the coaching and all this stuff, you know, new age, and things, because they have to cope with this. So I think they try to block the antagonism. They don't want to see it, so they go coaching, no? And so, and then I think that I insist with the figure of the people, but because the people linked to this idea of, I like to think it linked to the idea of George Bataille, of dual sovereignty. The sovereignty not only as the one that has the power to dominate, but also the sovereignty. The sovereign is the useless, what is excessive, and how you say, and domesticated, incalculated. And I think that the people is the radical other that opposes the homogenization of the social. And I think that neoliberalism tries to homogenize the social, and that's why I think this is a radical other. That's where I see the potency of the people, but I don't know. But that's it.
Shall we take two questions from the audience?
Yeah.
I would like to encourage students or those who have not yet spoken to take the mic.
A minha pergunta vai direcionada ao Dunker, se eu entendi. Na sua fala, você fala sobre a lógica do condomínio.
A condominial logic, the walls, the relation with individuals to the cities. So one of the first measures of the city mayor of São Paulo was this operation that is called Beautiful City, and then he took all the beautiful arts. Could you please tell something about that, the relation between individuals or subjects and cities, how it happens?
Então, é bom exemplo, né, de como você
It's a very good example.
de político que
When you
não é
have a
político,
politician that is not a politician, at least he doesn't say so. He says that he is a person that overcame this level that is not so good, where there is antagonism,
uma certa tensão de posições e se estabelece como alguém que é vamos dizer assim, alguém que tem domínio do saber fazer. Então, qual que é a primeira ideia que o sujeito tem, né? Pintar e homogeneizar a nossa cidade, acabando com os grafites e mostrando, de certa forma, aquilo do que ela é realmente feita, muros. Você tira o grafite, tira o cobre, o que você mostra? Um muro cinza. Exatamente o exemplo do ato cardinal, né, em que você tenta, vamos dizer assim, negar uma coisa e acaba denunciando ela de forma mais clara e evidente. Né? Isso vem caracterizando as intervenções. Né? Veja os exemplos que o Lacan dá. Né? São todos exemplos que eles, assim, são crimes que são incorporados segundo uma certa lógica publicitária. É o caso.
That's the case.
Melhor exemplo que eu devia ter trabalhado no texto.
Of São Paulo. I'm sure he must have read my text. Well, my speech, I'm completely hopeless of what is happening because of the mobilization of death, regardless of a power to live. I have three questions. My first question is, what is our response to the Brazilian society? What is the word that we have of the society that does not rely on what is happening in Brazil? We work ourselves and the others, the left and the right, the evangelics and ourselves. I want to know, according to our reflections, ideas, what is the contribution that we can give to this population that is so distrustful? And the second question, when we have a debate that discusses democracy, for those people that are black, poor, they are workers, indigenous, travestis, MST, occupation schools that live in this country. How can we talk about democracy instead of talking to everything that happens in Brazil, instead of mobilizing everybody together? How can I discuss this further? I'm restless about this discussion. I'm not talking on behalf of anybody. I'm talking on my behalf.
Eu me pergunto onde está
My question is with where Jota Mombasa, the leader of queer movement, Sueli Carneiro, black woman, intellectual, where Luisa, professor travesti, professor of philosophy. And then I'm talking about on behalf of students. The idea of repression is much more important than a conceptual reference. This changes completely. Where are the teachers of philosophy of this country? And I keep on saying that it seems to me, the feeling that I have after 3 years being here with you, these ladies that are strong, this public that is so strong, that is present here today, the need of a radical change of intellectual positioning. My question is, what are we going to do when we leave this seminar? What are we going to do after this meeting? I have lots of theoretical experience, but in terms of experience of democracy, what are we going to do when we leave this room? Because of that, my speech, my question, are the doors that are closed in the doors in this place here are the same doors that we saw in the beginning of the manifestation against Judith Butler. And my question is, who closes these doors? And my question is even stronger, what is our democratic experience facing this disruptive moment that we live now? And why is it so intense? We are suffering every day in this country. So my question is, what people are we? What is this condominium that we are talking about? And who are we talking to in democratic manners? We are so different in terms of racism that we could say, I'm not going to go into that, but we delegate things. We know that the society is racist, but we act as if nothing was taking place in this country. This model of disruption says about ourselves, about us. We talk about democracy, but we don't produce the democratic experience. What is this? I leave this event neither strong, neither weak, but I'd like to have had more democratic experience. So we should have a more critical experience about Americas. Thank you, and I apologize for being...
I think your many questions deserve many answers. Very seriously, I thank you for your intervention. Maybe we can take some of that up in our final remarks. I do think that, I'll just say this here, which is that this is the second of a set of international collaborations, and one of the things we are thinking about is how does a collaboration work and when does it not work, right? Where does it become productive? Where does it meet its impasse? What has to happen for a collaboration to work well? I will tell you that when I was 2 years ago in Salvador, in the Desfazendo Género, many people said, well, where do you go next? And I said, I'm going to São Paulo. And they said, oh, we don't have any connection to São Paulo. And I thought, why is that? So one immediate question, right? We're here, we're undertaking an experimental collaboration. Why aren't there more collaborations? I mean, I know it's the other side, but that's where there's so much going on there. And why isn't there more interconnectedness? Why aren't there cultural institutions that are dedicated to developing artistic, critical, democratic collaborations for that? So that's just a little bit of what it looks like from here. I think it's a very important question. Maybe I think what we will do, because our time is short, and I do hope to address some more of those questions, I'd like to ask, well, first of all, to thank our wonderful panel. this was hard conceptual and political work this afternoon. And then to just take a moment to thank Brianna George. Brianna, are you sitting here with us today? Where is she? Okay, so she's up there. It's hard to believe that Brianna George is a single individual, but she is the person who has helped to conceptualize all of the logistics of this event. She worked closely with the Sesc staff, who are great. She made personal contact with everybody who has entered this event as a participant, and she has an amazing way of getting everything done, of being amazingly efficient, and of being generous, warm, and personally connected with every human being who walks through her path. And I feel very honored to work with her, and we could not have done this without you, so I bow to you. Here's Vladimir with what you're going to make some final comments.
Ah, yeah? Ok, então eu gostaria de fazer três rápidas.
To have three remarks. Firstly, I'd like to thank, on my behalf, all the support we have had to perform this seminar in very difficult conditions, very complicated, as you well know. However, we are able to come to an end. We have achieved our objectives, not only discuss, but also have this debate, to take it from the university, to be able to do it here in this place. We could have done that in the University of São Paulo, but would be, between walls. We have to bring the debate for a different space in which there is a circulation not only of academics, but other participants as well. And I think that in these current circumstances, our country is far from being something, clear and evident. So the other aspect is about the internal quality of these discussions that we have held.
It seems to me that it was very important that the debate was conducted about the ends of democracy and the populist strategies and asceticism regarding democracy and the search for popular sovereignty. I want to remember that in Brazil, the tradition of reflection and debate on populism is a long, extensive tradition that dates back to the 50s and 60s. It's always a tradition that approached populism from a conservative point of view. It could not be different because inside Brazilian history, the discussion on populism were born, and there is an impasse in the intellectual class regarding the Vargas hegemony in Brazilian politics. And therefore, this shaped the national thought that might bring about some specificity to our approaches and hindered a reflection on populism of the left wing. And so this structural reflection have never existed in Brazil, in fact. It is a discussion that we find in Argentina and in other places, but in Brazil this did not happen due to our own history specificities. Nonetheless, we have a populist left-wing experience in the last decade. Even though I know that the same description of this experience as a populist experience does not come without some controversy, very strong one, due to our own referential. So bring this discussion here and allows that other versions of what is a populist experience, so have it circulating in our environment seems to be very important. And also to understand that to us populism is not just an insurgency theory, it is is also a government possibility. We will always think about this experience that we had, these experiences of populist government of left-wing, what are the advances and what were the limits? So this possibility of circulating series of experiences and the central role of the debate in contemporary philosophy of politics, which is a concept that says that in all countries there is a debate regarding what it in fact encompasses and is able to potentialize. So I think that in this sense it is very important that our type of experience can circulate within this global debate. And then I want also to say a third thing, which is to regarding the collocations of Marilia, to say that I think that they are very important, and many of them I don't agree. And I think it's very good now to have this open and honest discussion regarding an issue that is totally central, which is the role of the intellectual class and of the university in a process of dismantling of the minimum guarantees of the liberal democracy, and also in the process of reflection of the potentialities and of the alternatives of radical political experience in the next moment. I want to insist on that because, in fact, it does not seem to me to be very productive and neither sensitive to start to enter an intellectual masochism now, which is to put ourselves in a situation in which we say that, see, our strength is limited, our debates, they do not have no reach, they seem to be scholarly debates, our action, therefore, cannot produce this vital elan that makes the masses to raise and take it in its own hand the possibilities of autonomy creation. So at the end of the day, what you're doing here is some empty stuff, which is like a beautiful hand movement, but just aesthetically speaking. I want to insist on that because it's very funny. We are always accused of two things that are contradictory. And this happens many times. The first thing is that if the intellectual class enters in a more effective way.
Okay, but I have 2 minutes. Okay, you don't have. Okay, great. Mas então, só rapidamente, só para eu poder completar essa discussão, porque eu sei que ela está longe de ser uma discussão simples.
Just to conclude, I know it's not a simple discussion. We are accused of being dirigents, because it happened many times, or to be on the side of the problems. This, I believe, it's one of the main difficulties for us to understand what, in fact, is the contribution of the intellectual class on this debate. I want to insist that if a discussion such as this one was received in this country in the way that you have seen, it's because the university is not irrelevant. What is done in the university does not circulate only here. What we do at our best and what we do in the worst, we don't mobilize very well, but maybe this is not the function. The function may be to allow the processes to enter constellations, and within this constellation there is those that have this militant force, and there are those that are going to continue to insist that the circulation of ideas create tensions in the public opinion that goes out of the university, go beyond, and oblige those that are trying to create and produce new situations to face possibilities that they might have not thought about. So in this sense, to conclude, because we don't have a lot of time, in some way what we look into doing is to create a constellation in which all the people that have their contributions to make can do so. Each one fights with its own instrument, and we need to know the instruments so that we can fight together. That's what I had to say.
Thank you. How are you doing? I want to thank Vladimir and Natalia again for co-organizing this with me. I thought perhaps just a few final remarks. As you know, a collaboration is not a totality. It's a living, conflicted, and self-critical movement that is plagued by the problem of translation and also incited by that very same problem. And one of our tasks in coming here and in opening up a set of questions and producing a set of frameworks is to see, do these work, do they not work? How do we need to revise our framework and our questions? So for me, as is usually the case, my desire is to deepen the questions. I don't have good answers, and I'm distrustful of many people who do. I think one of the things that has happened here today and in the last 2 days is that we have inquired into both the necessity and the limits of representation as part of our idea of democracy, being represented in language, being represented in government. How central is this representative model to our understanding of democracy? Is the task to increase representation or to be more fully represented? Is representation at the center of the question of democracy? Well, one problem that emerged, and this came up in several sessions, is that sometimes and increasingly, people are formally represented through a vote, but they are in fact disenfranchised much more than they are enfranchised through that representation. So there's a difference between representation and enfranchisement or empowerment, and we've had to look at the limits of formal representation. What happens if a population achieves formal representation, but and they are free and equal before the law, and yet that freedom is empty and that equality turns out not to be true. They are unfree and they are unequal. How does that substantive inequality and substantive unfreedom then get articulated politically when people feel themselves to be failed or betrayed by formal representation? Some of the speakers have suggested that we look for a more radical change at the level of grammar, logic, and metaphysics, and others focused on political claims, practices, institutions, and economic systems. So there's a huge tension there. And one question is, are there ways to mediate between those who think we must change our logic and grammar before we can have true change, and those who are thinking about macro-political structures or broader or more radical economic change, whether that's in a more substantively socialist or communist direction? One great achievement of this conference is that communist has become speakable, so we're going to thank our enemies for that. And I think also we spent a lot of time thinking about the nexus of neoliberalism and authoritarianism, trying to stay away from strictly causal models, but trying to understand the genealogies by which those two become implicated in one another. We also talked a great deal about time, the problem of progress. And this, I think, has become extremely important for us at this moment when so many people across the globe are wondering whether there can still be progress or whether the progress they once believed in turned out to be illusory. Was it always false? Was it always a lie? And a number of papers took this on, and I take it that we have to think maybe progress in a more complex way. Perhaps it is not unilinear. It certainly ought not to be thought about as deterministic. But also, some of our participants showed us extraordinary images of progress, of substantial achievements that have been made by radical social movements throughout the last century. And also we have engaged in some of the more important contemporary movements, whether they have leaders or whether they are without leaders, whether they're populist or whether they're popular. I don't have an answer to that. So I believe that we've done a great deal of this. We also asked whether there were ways of materializing democracy in ways that exceed or confound the formal model of representation. And I think we also had a robust debate about various kinds of populisms. We were reminded that Stuart Hall, in his writings on Thatcher, claimed that governments tend to check populism right before they become a popular movement. But we've also been told that some popular movements are indeed populist. So that's left for us to sort out. We talked a lot about authoritarianism, and I wonder whether what remains before us are some other terms that were introduced this evening, like tyranny, or terms like totalitarianism, or terms like fascism. How do we navigate this cluster of terms, and how do we navigate it differently depending on our histories and our languages and our ways of naming and mobilizing political experience. I want to say this, and I guess it will be the final thing I want to say, which is a serious issue. I mean, some people have said, why do we have the rise of right-wing conservative governments? And some of our friends on the left have said, well, we've made a mistake. We focused on race. We focused on gender. We focused on sexuality. We focused on the rights of disabled people. We focused on the indigenous. All of these issues are identity issues, and they deflected our attention away from a more substantial and important economic set of problems. So we should not let ourselves be deflected anymore by identity issues, and we should go back to the macroeconomic issues and really think that way. But if we do that, we have to ask, well, who are the poor? Who is disproportionately poor? It is the women, it is the indigenous, it is the people of color, right? It is the people who don't have access to adequate health care. Who is suffering economically? Is that an important question? I want to suggest to you that feminism and its concern with gender, queer theory, its concern with gender and sexuality, race studies and post-colonial studies, these are not identity politics. And I think the way in which they get characterized as identity politics is actually a lie, because they are, each of them, I mean, if we argue for gender freedoms, the freedom to develop oneself as the gender that one is, or to change genders, or to be recognized as transgendered, we are making an argument about freedom, we are making an argument about equality, and as such, we are making an argument about what a democracy should look like, right? In other words, democracy doesn't have any meaning if there isn't gender freedom, and if minorities and people of color do not have freedom and equality. So we have to ask whether our ideas of freedom, equality, and justice include gender justice, include racial justice, include economic justice, and whether we can even think those fundamental terms of democracy without them. So don't let people tell you that you're just doing some particularistic thing, and yet you're deflecting from the real aim of the left. I don't think that's true. I think all of these are struggles for freedom, struggles for equality, and struggles for justice, and certainly struggles for indigenous justice have been going on for a really long time on this continent. So I would also suggest that when people say that you're in the clutch of a gender ideology, or you've been your mind has been poisoned by either the ideology of gender or gender ideology, which apparently is authored by the devil, right? But here's the thing. Gender studies, gender movements, they have multiple origins. They are all over the world. They're in every research institution in the world. There is no way to have an intellectually substantive university without that field of study, not just in some corner, but pervading the study of economics, sociology, demographics, literature, film. So the point here is simply to say that if an ideology is something that is fixed, that tells you, for instance, that you were born female, so you must stay a woman. You were born female, so you must grow up heterosexual and marry a man and only have sex with that man. And you must have children and you must reproduce within the heterosexual family. Then we're talking about a gender ideology. That is gender ideology, okay? Okay. Anyway, I want to thank all of you for coming, and we'll make it work in a different way next time. Our next events, which will be following these, will be one that's looking at civil disobedience and dissent and revolution, and we will also be putting together a group called the Arts of Critique, focusing on art. And centrally engaging the question of race and the racial imaginations, the racial imaginary, as Claudia Rankine puts it. So thank you for coming, for staying with us, and for all of you who protested to make sure this could happen. I am grateful. Thank you.